Good to be with all of you. We're going to talk now about the politics of cybersecurity, and we have a wonderful panel. Claude Barfield, who's resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a very good friend of mine from the trade days, and I've been so interested to see your writing recently, particularly about China and cyber, which we'll get into. Then we have Peter Warren Singer, strategist and senior fellow at New America, who's just held about every great advisory job in internet cyber world. I mean, he's sort of official, and he has this brand new book out that I've just literally spent 30 seconds briefing through. I'm already addicted, called Ghost Fleet by P.W. Singer and August Cole, a novel of the next world war. And it is done in the mode of Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising. It's a heavily footnoted novel. Which means you're trying to sort of tell anyone who thinks you're selling secrets that you actually got. Is that why you footnote your novel? Yeah, so you know what's real, and you're afraid of being,
When we reveal how to hack a U.S. intelligence building,
right.
We document it rather than...
I do note in the very last chapter, they meet in the McCain Senate office building. Yes. But I recommend that folks take a look at that.
If they'd only had this at Watergate, it might have turned out differently.
And then we have my good friend Shane Harris, who is author of At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex, a senior correspondent at the Daily Beast, and himself was a bit jealous when I called Meg King the diva of cyber nightmares, and so he wanted to be a diva as well.
Sure.
So I hereby dub you a diva of the cyber intelligence world. But let me just start out and ask, maybe a dumb question, but as we're getting into the political season, and I want to talk both about the substance of cyber, but also the politics of cyber. Is this really going to matter in this upcoming presidential campaign? Do you sense that cyber concerns matter either within things like the debates or the competitive field, or that they really matter to the broad electorate? I'll start with Peter.
So in preparation for this, I actually tried to research what the different candidates have said and done on cybersecurity. And it's because it's fascinating. We were talking about this back in the green room that has the best view of a green room we've ever been in.
Has Donald Trump said anything? Big problem.
No. So let's walk. So first, the issue is fascinating because it's something that Americans care about. Polling shows they're more afraid of a cyber attack than things like North Korean nuclear weapons or Iranian nuclear weapons or climate change, authoritarian Russia, all these issues, and yet cyber attacks scare them more. And yet, and it's something that's been asked about in the debates, framed as a security issue. But when you go through the various candidates' approaches, there's very little new proposals there. And most of it seems to be kind of point of emphasis differences. So if you're looking on the left, Sanders essentially talks about, he talks about cybersecurity as an important issue. He has a pretty fleshed out space on his website about it, but mainly then puts it back into kind of a privacy debate. Clinton's website, at least I couldn't find anything on it. And I think that may relate to the fact that it would quickly get framed into another computer security issue. But yet, in her discussions, points of emphasis, she's talked about it in terms of she's gone a little bit further than the administration has on pointing the finger at China. Offhand, she once said that they steal anything that doesn't move. If you get to the right, again,
aren't we hacking cars now? Aren't they hacking? We can so moving things are now part of the hacking.
Far as stunt hacking, but maybe in the future. On the right, again, you have a split on the privacy issue. So Rand Paul and Christie have the dust up in the debate. Carly Fiorina is supposedly the technology expert in the group, but she was the one who talked about cyber walls. Which I hope this conference will help us figure out what that means, because it's not a technical term I'm familiar with.
We'll leave that to Shane.
Yeah. And
get ready.
Finally, you have pushes by, for example, Bush and Rubio, who've basically emphasized, they've put forward documents, but it's mainly sort of saying, I'm going to be a better leader at it, rather than real substantive. So, Bush, for example, critiques Obama for not working with the private sector enough, says he's not leading Congress enough, leaves out the fact that there has been a pretty good push to private sector through the NIST process, and Congress is controlled by the Republicans, so it's kind of hard to blame Obama for that. Trump, not much there policy-wise. The one other campaign-related thing.
That's a general point, I think.
Yeah.
He's going to build a cyber wall. It's going to be beautiful.
The one other campaign-related point that I find fascinating, that I think we will see in this campaign season, is the security of their own campaigns.
Yeah.
And so, for example, Cruz reputedly has the weakest because he's using many of the same measures that Nigerian crown princes would on their website. Clinton and Rubio get the best credit for the most kind of sophisticated security for their websites, at least their campaign-related websites. Trump
has this been written about? I mean, so his hotel got hacked?
So that's his cyber. The only thing you can find on Trump and cybersecurity together is Trump hotels got hacked this summer.
If you were going to be
the best ever hacked.
If you were going to be the Atlantic's moderator at the first ever Atlantic presidential debate, and you were to pose a cyber question or hold these candidates to task, what would be a few of the questions you'd put forward?
I, for example, would love to hear when is it and when is it not an act of cyber war? Because that is obviously it's a term that's abused. We have a whole number of incidents where people in politics have used that phraseology, whether it's the Sony breach or the OPM breach. It's a fuzzy area in terms of international law, but at the end of the day, the commander-in-chief is really the only one who can decide that. It will be up to them to decide whatever we come down in international law or interpretation. So that I would want to know from them, when is it and when is it not an actual act of cyber war? And I mean in terms of war, not war on poverty, war on sugar phrasing.
Is Dana Priest still here? No. Okay, so Dana Priest, who for the Washington Post wrote an outstanding set of articles on the rise of the military intelligence complex, which of course had an incredible punctuation point and further explication by Shane. But Dana's been with us much of the morning. I was going to ask, you, Shane, in this world where you see, and Dana and you have both articulated, it's become a sprawling, giant, vast bureaucracy in which accountability is missing, and even the knowledge by those at the helm is pretty limited. And so I guess let's go from the political angle. I mean, I'd love you to respond on your own work, but what kinds of responsible stewardship should we be expecting from political leaders when we've had people like you and Dana sort of say that it's limitless and so big that it's beyond that capacity?
Yeah, I mean, in one way, maybe to get to your point about the questions you'd ask them in a debate, and say, how many of you have actually had your campaign websites hacked or your emails hacked? What are you doing to protect yourselves? Look, the one question I would ask them too is, what are you going to do to prevent another breach like what happened at the Office of Personnel Management? Okay, so talk about accountability and responsibility there for a second. This was the big hack against OPM that stole 22 million people's personnel files, 5 million fingerprints, basically gave an intelligence blueprint to the Chinese military and intelligence service for people they might want to try to recruit or to blackmail, et cetera. I'm aware of only one person who lost their job over that, and that was the head of the Office of Personnel Management. I am not aware of anywhere in the OPM's charter where it says cybersecurity is your responsibility, right? So where are we going to put the onus on preventing huge breaches like that? I would say that it lies largely in the Homeland Security Department. If you've got a .gov at the end of your website address, the Homeland Security Department is actually supposed to be doing data protection and security for you. The OPM is not a data security agency.
But is that true? Because others have said that Homeland Security has sort of evolved in that direction, but it wasn't an explicit.
Well, it's statutorily. It's actually what it says in their charter. I mean, the law says that you've got this, sort of mandate. There's an interesting story. If you go back about 5 or 6 years ago, and this gets to the question of sprawling bureaucracies and accountability, and maybe the next president will want to do something about this. There was a moment where the Director of National Intelligence's office, the DOD, and the OPM kind of got together, and they said, we've got this huge backlog of security clearances. All these, hundreds of thousands of people applying for security clearances. Again, going to the top secret, America sprawling, millions of people have security clearances, and we're not processing them through fast enough. So why don't we take all of our respective databases, our systems in DOD, the Intel community, and the OPM, let's put them all together, consolidate it, and we'll do it all really rapidly and get through it. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence looked at that and said, there is no way in hell we're doing that. because we've seen the OPM system and it can be breached. And we're not putting our top secret personnel files into a system that can get hacked. Well, if 6 years ago, the head of the intelligence community realized that the major personnel system and record system in the government was vulnerable to be breached, why didn't somebody do something about it? Isn't that their job? Isn't counterintelligence their job? And I think that this is something where getting your own house in order before like the next president starts lecturing the private sector about all the weaknesses they have would be a good place to start.
I want to come to Claude, and all of you just feel free to comment on each other, but before I do, on the China front, just, technology seems to be racing so fast that when you look at the time the Obama administration came in 7 years ago, we were in a very different technological landscape, right? And whether you agree with what Hillary Clinton's judgment or not, people of Hillary Clinton's stature were, if they knew about it, were getting private servers. I asked Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, whether he had his own email, and he shared with me that he didn't ever really use email. He had never sent email, so he wasn't vulnerable in those ways. So we have a kind of generational literacy challenge, which is one part. Also, Peter, I'd just love to get input from you. You've been an advisor to DOD, an advisor to the intelligence communities, an advisor to the Obama campaign on these issues. What is your candid assessment of the literacy of people in that political world that Shane is saying have been out to lunch and slow and behind in these issues?
It was bad and horrifying. It's getting better, but too slowly. So the bad and horrifying is you can use all of these different examples of people who I remember speaking with someone who'd been in one of these very senior roles, and he talked about it in the framework of well, I can't even program my VCR to make that 12 stop blinking, and I'm like, you're still using a VCR. It's like part of the problem. Or the prior head of Department of Homeland Security talked about how social media was a waste, and that's why she hadn't been on it since.
This is Janet Napolitano,
yeah,
but she didn't use email either until she got to the University of California.
Yeah, that one, the problem of talking about social media, that she hadn't been on it since,
right.
I believe the date was when she'd been in a role in 1997. And pull back and think about what social media existed back then. So you can go on and on with these anecdotes of that, but it's not just it's the same in other sectors. So 70% of business executives have made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, not 70% of information security executives, but executives in general. Find me a major MBA program right now that teaches cybersecurity as part of your normal management responsibility. We've got, you can take a class in it. We've got certain special, but not for people who are making general decisions in it. And that's the same thing at the schools. We teach our journalists, our lawyers, our diplomats. So we've got a generational gap. But that generational gap is going to stick with us as long as we don't change our education pipelines. And again, I'm not just talking about building up specialists. I'm talking about people in all sorts of walks of life are already making cybersecurity decisions. The challenge in this sort of catch-up process is we're in a town of bureaucracy. The decisions that are being made right now on how you organize, whether it's what happens next in the OPM, to the Pentagon, to whatever, the laws that we write, they will be sticky. So we can say, don't worry, we'll catch up on this when all the digital natives move into positions. But in this space, that won't happen for 10, 15, 20 years, and the decisions that are made right now will be sticky. And so that's kind of my frustration on this. But when I say getting better, you're seeing, at least within certain key roles in government, people are being forced to get better. So we had a discussion with the cyber coordinator, Daniel, and he was saying, previously a cybersecurity issue that was reaching to the level of the president was about once every 3 months. And now it's once a week or more frequently. And of course, that's forcing people they're getting better, they're getting smarter, they're getting more nuanced at it. I see that within certain parts of the executive branch. Other parts, not so much. I think for the OPM director, it wasn't just what happened at OPM, it was the performance on the Hill. And then on the legislative side, just a massive amount of catch-up is needed. And to go back to that point about cyber war, that's a phraseology that is just utterly abused in the congressional side. And the worry is that foreign partners and or adversaries actually take that seriously when people say things like, the breach at Sony was an act of war. That's a term that has real meaning, as opposed to.
Does your book start with a breach of a film company? No.
Surprisingly, someone stealing gossipy emails or the script to the next James Bond movie, I don't believe is an act of war. I'm a traditionalist. I think war has to involve politics and violence, even if it's through digital means.
Well, let me take us back to 1997 with Claude for a minute, because 1997 we were very active in social media, but our means was fax machines, and we were pretty good at it, I think, at that time. But I hosted you in 1990. I hosted Claude in 1997 for a trade talk, in which Claude was, I shouldn't say embrace dumping, but in the trade and economic area, he didn't see dumping and some of the things that China and other places have been accused of as disruptive to our interests. You've completely changed now in terms of the cyber world of characterizing China as a strategic economic predator that needs to be taught some lessons. Do I have that wrong?
Yes.
Okay.
I haven't changed my views, which are the views of most economists on dumping.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have any dumping.
Well, I didn't say you changed your views on dumping, but just you've looked at
what China is doing today is not this. I mean, you could get to China, you could go to the trade law and talk to China about China and anti-dumping. But what we're talking about in cyber is not, I think, dumping.
No, I agree, but it's just sort of interesting.
It's intellectual property. So I haven't really, my views there about stealing intellectual property would be the same as they are today. So that, but I want to get back to this point about the question you'd asked the candidates. I think, to be fair to the candidates, whether Republican or Democrat, and this includes the administration, I don't think anybody has an answer to that. So the administration is groping its way. And this is not a shot at these guys, because I think this is all new stuff.
Right.
And if you just look at the way they reacted to Sony and then the China thing, which were very different, I think, attacks. If you call it not an act of war, but an attack. With Sony, you really saw with the administration where you get gripped, and it would be true as a Republican or a Democrat, and that is the FBI first denied it knew what had happened, and then delayed, and we had all these theories going around as to whether it was internal, who did it. But the administration asked for that because they didn't come out. Only later did they say they knew and that they were going to do something about it. So the other thing was that they didn't really reveal. I mean, you get the question of attribution, and then are you going to reveal enough information to prove? The administration was behind the 8 ball there because people didn't really believe them when they finally came out and made the attribution. So they were groping their way, and then you get to China, which is a wholly different operation, which was not. And here you got a division. We were talking in the green room where there was testimony just last week with Clapper and I forget the guy who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Clapper has been very firm from the beginning, and others. We just should tip our hats to the Chinese. I said I would have done the same thing. This is traditional espionage. But the defense guy was asked about whether there should be retribution to the Chinese or retaliation, and he said that it's still on the table, which is something Clapper was saying, no.
So make this more clear for me. What do you think the right policy course is?
I beg your pardon?
So tell me what the right course of action is.
Well, I would agree with Clapper in terms of what happened to the OPM. That to get back to the kinds of things these guys were talking about, it's our own vulnerability internally. On the cyber side, and to go back to the summit that they just held, I mean, I think the surprising decision of the Chinese to agree to that cyber theft, the theft of intellectual property, is a no-no, was a surprise to the administration, and I tip my hat to them on that. On the other hand, I am one who thinks that where we are now and with the way the administration has kind of dithered about this previously, I would not wait. I would go if they have a case. And they signaled in the weeks and months before the President Xi came here that they had built a case, that they have intellectual property, they can show a trade secret that has been stolen and used. And I think it's important for the United States at some point to have a case that is really solid. And I'll just end with the fact that the famous hacking case of the 5 PLA officers was a very weak case. The intellectual property there was minuscule and nothing. Well, the other thing the administration did, to get back to my trade side, is it mixed up in the indictment the stealing of minor intellectual property, trade secrets on the one hand, with, to get back to something you just said, with the stealing of information about an anti-dumping case.
Right.
Now that is the kind of thing we routinely do ourselves. We go in to find out what the French are thinking or what the Japanese are thinking about trade cases and trade policy. And we're not about to stop that. So my only point is that we need to get our house in order, as I think the administration is groping toward, so what is and what is not off limits.
You raise a really interesting point about what we do ourselves, which I hope we'll get to, but,
Yes.
but go ahead.
Well, it's a way of linking your past question and this one in agreement. So to the generational side, we constantly are using the term deterrence and the need to rebuild deterrence, to search for deterrence. And when I say we, it's everything from administration officials and congressional testimony to, you can see these statements by, for example, Jeb Bush. But they're framing deterrence in the Cold War deterrence by the fear of overwhelming punishment, a retaliation. The problem is, it's the bumper sticker version of Cold War strategy. Two, we're not in that world where you have multiple different attackers with multiple different levels of interest carrying out different kinds of attacks. So we're using deterrence to talk about everything from we need to make the trade secrets being stolen stop to OPM breaches, which is espionage, to whatever. You have that, but then you finally have the fact that we're not equal in terms of our vulnerability. So this is not each side using a nuclear weapon, they're both will be hit the same. So
But in the nuclear, you would say we're not hardened enough, right? And
what I'm getting at is there's a different kind of deterrence which wasn't possible in the Cold War that is possible today, which is deterrence by denial. That's what we should be focusing on, which is making yourself less vulnerable so that the other side, they are less incentivized to attack because they're going to get less from it. The other way of describing it is it's the magic word in cybersecurity of resilience. So overwhelming punishment, unfortunately, isn't something that's kind of the easy, ready answer the way it was in the Cold War. It's more about defending yourself and building your own resilience. So it's harder for a China, an Iran, a North Korea, or just a cyber criminal to get what they want.
Just quickly to that point, Admiral Mike Rogers, I mentioned before you got here, was at a International James Bond night last night, showed up. I was surprised you weren't there in your tux at the Jefferson. But he talks publicly and on the record that we need to develop a culture of deterrence in the world of cyber threats.
But what I'm getting is what you mean by deterrence. We're all thinking of deterrence as hack back.
Well, there's mutual. There are lots of different dimensions of deterrence, and I agree with you. But Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on game theory, which was considered to be vital in terms of U.S.-Soviet deterrence theory and strategy, in his Nobel speech, he said deterrence did not replicate human assessments of mutually assured destruction. It was a set of norms and habits that had to be taught to the Soviets in back and forth exchanges, and then through that inculcation of thinking, of assessment, you were able to kind of construct a sense of deterrence. And so part of that requires communicating what your red lines are, how you think about things, the whole culture of how we see cyber along these lines. And I think what Claude just shared about mixing everything in one basket, whether it's economic or national security, is important because it's very, very blurry. And as you said, we overstate the issue of that. But I just want to read a Shane Harris tweet for a minute and do a test. Raise your hand. This was Shane Harris, at Shane Harris. Raise your hand if you actually believe China will stop economic espionage. Honest question. So raise your hand if you think China.
This is after the big agreement last week.
The agreement. Anybody? Not Jean-Francois? No? Yeah?
When pigs fly.
Yeah, the one pigs fly. So it is interesting that there's a major doubt even in these steps forward, Claude. But Shane?
Yeah, we talk about deterrence. I think we can give the administration some credit here. In the agreement that we've reached with the Chinese, there's some big moments there. Okay, like we made it very clear to President Xi and his people that we would like it very much when he came over here to acknowledge publicly our concerns about economic espionage via computer hacking, cyber espionage, whatever you want to call it. That bucket, not the potential attacks on infrastructure, not what the military does, that bucket of things. And he did that. And that's a big deal. Now, whether or not they're going to stick by their promise to stop this, they did not acknowledge that they'd done it,
Exactly.
which is also a key thing. We would have loved that he did, and he wasn't going to go there. But right now, essentially, they're saying, we agree with you. This bucket of things, this shouldn't be happening. We're going to stop doing that. Now comes the question of how do you verify that? How do you enforce that? And I think what's very important for this administration, and it will be important for the next one too, is that if that administration finds that they're not living up to their end of the bargain, that these kinds of attacks are still happening, that the intellectual property theft is still happening, you've got to then be prepared to retaliate, and that's going to be in the form of sanctions. We telegraphed, they leaked it all over town to all of us that we're going to sanction them. If they don't say yes to this agreement, we're totally going to sanction them. And I think the Chinese, to some degree, kind of snapped to attention a little bit on this, or at least were willing to sort of, start engaging in a dialogue. And we are going to actually have a dialogue now. So every 6 months, our Homeland Security and law enforcement officials are going to get together with their folks. We're going to talk about how things are going. Notably absent from that conversation is any member of the PLA, by the way, which is responsible for a huge part of the intellectual property theft. I mean, you can think of the PLA like a shell corporation that essentially does hacking for the purposes of benefiting its own companies. But we're making progress here. It's a step. And what the administration did was articulated, look, these are the set of things that we find unacceptable. Here's what we want you to agree to. And now we're kind of moving forward in a direction of trying to have some enforcement and some norms around.
The only thing I would not wait 6 months. I am assuming, maybe defer to you guys, know maybe the technology better than I do. I'm assuming, as I said before, the administration has built a case that they have got one or two examples. And if within the next month or weeks or a month at most, that they know, I assume they know what's happening there. And if that is not stopping or ceasing, I would move.
So technically tell us, Claude, if they had a case
here, I'm just saying this is where we are now, and they signaled that they were ready to go. So.
But that's again the great illustration of the difference with kind of Cold War theory is it's okay, if you do the sanctions, then what happens? So,
but that's a case anytime.
But that's my point.
6 months.
Typically, the discussion back in the day was you hit me, I'll hit back. This is a game, and why we've pulled away from actually implementing sanctions is it becomes a dance. So, okay, you sanction these companies, and then suddenly
they'll retaliate.
A number of American companies
I agree
lose
with that.
contracts that are worth much more.
But
That's
we are going,
fear.
and
so that's why we're floating it, but not doing it.
I agree with that, and they've got to. I'm sure our tech companies are scared to death about this kind of spiral. On the other hand, when you make that commitment, you have to go down that road.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nobody's going to pay any attention.
But is it a commitment if it was just floating?
So you're advocating a rules-based behavior, charging a case, taking it forward, trying to create an architecture,
has already set out
which I think can make a lot of sense. But I guess my question is, in that world, you said something very interesting, Claude, about what the United States has been doing. And I guess, we were talking to Meg King earlier about ISIS and social media and its sophistication in hacking. And you look at what we've seen the Chinese doing, we've seen defining moments of the OPM case and North Koreans, et cetera, with the Sony hack. Is in that world, what are we doing that hasn't been reported out there? Or are we just victims? I mean, because if you read the American media on this, we seem to be largely victims, despite our sprawling intelligence. So what nefarious things have we been up to, Shane, that we don't know about?
Right. No, this is what makes my job
It's
really
not
fun.
nefarious, but there's a lot of it.
Yeah.
But you're
what non-nefarious but cool things have we been doing?
We love to talk about how vulnerable we are and how we're victimized, and those things are all true. And we can do some really powerful things to other people. So, for instance, I write about in my most recent book, the first half of it is about all the things that we do to other people. So how we incorporated, for instance, the ability to intercept massive amounts of communications in real time into the ground war in Iraq. So we effectively, hacked the Iraqi telecommunications network, and we could see all the text messages and get all the phone calls as they were moving and track the people using them. After the Sony attack, this is something that doesn't get widely reported, but the administration ordered sanctions on some actors in North Korea. And according to my reporting, we actually did some targeted strikes, if you want to call them, on North Korean networks. We can reach out and touch people. We can make things happen. We could turn lights off if we wanted to do that. All of the things that we imagine that we're terrified about people doing to us, it's because we know how to do them. And that doesn't get as much play. But we have enormous capabilities in this area. And I think that this is a play, I would imagine that after the OPM hack, if there wasn't already an operation inside the National Security Agency to try and go and find the equivalent of the Chinese OPM and steal those records, I would imagine they're trying to do that now. We're very, very good at this stuff. The reason that we talk about the vulnerabilities, and Pete was talking about this earlier, is we have the most of them, I think. There's a reason why we're not hacking Chinese companies to steal their intellectual property. They don't have anything we want, right? We are the vulnerable party here. And it's much easier for people in government and the military to talk about those vulnerabilities so they can plus up the budgets and we can have that conversation. But it does tend to obscure the fact that, we're really good at this stuff. And we shouldn't be afraid of talking about that, I think. If we're talking about moving towards norms of behavior, we also have to be honest about what our capabilities are and when we would use them and under what circumstances we would go on the offense.
But that's where we're still, and I'm not criticizing the administration because any administration would be in this position where we're only, say, a third or halfway there as to telling the world what we will do and when and under what circumstances.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one problem you do have is the administration, again, I can understand why, but if you guys, and we talk to the Congress, for the Congress, OPM is the key. They care about Sony, they care about other things, but that really shocked the Congress. And it's where you get whether it's Republicans or Democrats, we need to get hit back at them. Whereas the administration knows that that's not a place that you're likely to hit back.
I mean, that's the challenge of this.
And that's where we are right now.
The mature discussion is we don't like the fact that you use government resources to target our government, but we accept that that's part of the game versus what is a real political issue is the fact that you went after private interests using government.
And it comes out of, we had Senator Gardner, who heads one of the security subcommittees, really much up on this at AEI about a month ago, and he made the point, he said, God, we attacked or we hacked back on Sony, which was just a destruction of private property. But when citizens' lives, 22 million of our citizens were put in jeopardy, we did nothing. So for the Congress, that juxtaposition really, they're very much aware of that. And he was a very sophisticated, he knows a lot about this.
Again, back to the political field for a minute. You mentioned that Bernie Sanders had a pretty sophisticated, which surprises me actually, he had a pretty sophisticated view, but it fell back into the privacy area. And that raises the fundamental questions of trust, government, what we saw with, the NSA, being compelled somewhat by the Snowden revelations to tell a lot more about it, what was doing than any of us knew. Seeing the revelations that we were spying on allies with things we were accusing, China of doing to us, et cetera. We're not an ally, but engaged in that. How corrosive is the trust issue in terms of getting corporations and citizens to want to live in a world in which they trust the U.S. government's stewardship role in this? Is that a political feature?
Well, I want to be clear when I'm use the phrase sophisticated. I'm not making a political judgment. I'm just saying, as an interested citizen, when I'm trying to find out what are the different candidates' stances on cybersecurity, there's some. He
had stuff and Hillary had nothing.
On the website, and it's got multiple bullet points, and then there's others where you have to do it by quotes, and then there's others where you Google the names together and just nothing pops up. And yet again, I go to the irony of this being a topic that citizens, at least in polling, say they really care about.
Right.
And again, I also compare that to the thin way it was handled in the debate so far, where there was an entire discussion around an imaginary cybersecurity term. That's frustrating to us. But the trust issue, I think, it works in two ways that combines what we're talking about here. There's the post-Snowden trust worry of essentially privacy concerns, and this is particularly coming from Silicon Valley, which is worried not just on the issues of privacy, but it's lost tens of billions of dollars worth of business due to international anger over the Snowden revelations. So there's that trust issue. Now the new one is the post-OPM one, which is private sector saying, hold it, government, you want me to share information with you, you're lecturing me on cybersecurity issues, you've just shown why I can't trust you on this because you can't keep your own house in order. So there's a new kind of trust issue that's emerged post-OPM.
And it comes out specifically in legislation. There's an irony here on both sides. With a lot of these Silicon Valley guys are Democrats. They're supporters of Obama. But the Silicon Valley administration have been at odds since Snowden. You look at the USA Freedom Act, and now you look at encryption, where they just don't agree. They've agreed to disagree, and there is a lack of trust. And it gets back to this question you made the point about the OPM, and there's this information sharing bill before Congress, sharing between the private sector and the government, and that is filtering into that particular debate also. On the Republican side, there's also something interesting below the level of the presidential, and that is if you look back at the divisions in the House over the USA Freedom Act, it was the libertarian side of the House Republicans beat out the security side, if you will, which was an astonishing thing to me at the time. But I still think those votes would be there. That is, the people who are very distrustful in the House of the kinds of things that they thought the administration was pushing in the USA Freedom Act versus the kind of libertarian views outside. So you do have that split. I think it'll be interesting to see how that works.
I'm going to discuss that with Congressman John Ratcliffe in a few minutes when he's up here. So we'll talk about those wings and cyber policy. Shane, when the Sony Hack was at its juiciest, and we were getting all sorts of stuff on Angelina Jolie and everything. We did a program, The Atlantic did, with Lisa Monaco and Fran Townsend. And Fran Townsend made big news that day at our event, really lambasting Sony for not having invested in the sort of cyber prophylactics and protections, and really went after American corporations and for what she called a sort of dereliction of responsibility. So I'm interested. A lot of people reacted to her and said, you don't get it. That's just, you can't, no company. In fact, Mike Rogers said no company can protect itself against state acts like that. Where's the right balance if this were to come up as a debate question? How do you get that balance right? What are the missing pieces of getting a smarter collaborative scene between the private sector and the government?
Well, that's a great question. To take the first part of it, there's, what is the responsibility of every company to do the bare minimum and the basics of protecting itself? Now, Sony, I think it turns out, probably did not do a very good job of that. But then you take a company like JP Morgan, which spends, $250 million reportedly a year on cybersecurity, and even it's not invulnerable to these kinds of attacks. The Sony case brings up a very interesting sort of case study and kind of thought experiment about where that seam could connect between the two. And in my reporting after it, I went and talked to intelligence officials and I said, okay, look, it's pretty obvious you guys know that it was North Korea. And you know that because you're inside their networks, right? You have pretty good visibility into who this. So did you see the attack coming? And the response that I got was, look, we're aware of the kinds of spear phishing and the kinds of attempted intrusions emanating from North Korea directed at American businesses. But did we see the one coming at Sony? No. And then the thought experiment becomes, okay, if you did, would you have a responsibility to inform that company that something was about to happen that they might want to prevent? And generally, I think the answer from the intelligence community would be, no, we don't think that we do. It's their responsibility, and we're not going to burn our sources and methods to tell them because we're inside the North Korean network to find out what they're doing in their nuclear program, or who Kim Jong-un is executing this week. So this is it's a really the seam is rough. Right? There are opportunities maybe for government to be doing more to alerting companies, but they're going to have to pick and choose, I think, what those industries are that they're going to warn. And I don't think there's a great appetite in this administration or in a future one for going out and warning companies.
What would
like
be
Sony.
the answer if it was a Southern Company nuclear plant?
That's different.
Yeah.
Warning critical infrastructure is a totally, I think, it is a different category.
Do we have a category on what critical infrastructure is?
If you look at the definition of it, it looks like it's every company under the sun could fit it. But generally, public utilities, the financial system to mean networks that are critical to the proper functioning of banks and the flow of money, things that are sort of central to our way of life, core industries. And there, I think, if the NSA were found to be detecting a potential nuclear or North Korean attack on the power grid and didn't warn the company, there would be hell to pay, and rightly so for that.
Fascinating.
That's where you have
Let
to
me open up
report.
to the questions and comments from the audience. Those are conference Boitin, and then we'll go back here.
Security and privacy. Today, apparently, the European Court of Justice decided that safe harbor is no more because of the NSA post-Snowden revelations. Has some impact, obviously, on transatlantic relationships. So I would like to have the opinion of the panelists on that.
On safe harbor issues ending and whatnot. Claude, thoughts?
Well, I think by the way, there's a very good op-ed in today's Financial Times by Robert Hitt on that. I guess my reaction is that I agree with Hitt that if you look at we haven't had a chance to look so much at the Court of Justice, but the original administrative law judge, a month ago, if you look at the evidence that was brought to bear, it's really flawed. I mean, it's as if nothing had happened in the United States since Snowden. That is, we don't have the USA Freedom Act. And even before that, there are safeguards that were in place that the administration belatedly had to try to convince us of. So, I think the Europeans are off base here. As a matter of fact, I see collisions coming in a lot of directions between the United States and Europe in this area. The whole question of the right to be forgotten. And in my own view, since I am a trade person before I'm a cybersecurity person, I think this ought to be right front and center on the U.S.-European trade agreement. I would not let this stuff go, because you just keep doing things that are either, in my mind at any rate, out of ignorance, or just it's really a kind of way of knocking down the U.S. firms that are highly competitive against putative national champions in Europe. And this is just a part of a mosaic in my mind.
Peter, any quick thoughts on this?
I'm going to do something awful and actually quick thoughts on the prior question.
Go ahead.
Because we framed it as a issue, rightly, of should companies be warned or not. But really, so there's one aspect of the information sharing problem, and that's either warnings aren't happening, or a common complaint of business is that they're not getting good quality information, that the information exchange with government is really only moving in one direction. But you have other issues there where essentially it's not just about market awareness, it's about market incentives. And the incentives are not aligned well in a number of sectors for good cybersecurity. And that's everything from, yes, Sony, you don't want to blame the victim, but this is something where they had repeated cybersecurity problems and still had reportedly very poor cybersecurity practices. Well, part of the reason is, look what happened to their stock price during the period of this. Did it go down? No, it actually went up during this. What's the incentive? Did people lose their jobs, et cetera? That's changing now.
Has anybody written on how Sony's doing now?
Well,
I mean, Hillary Clinton probably will invest in smarter cyber stuff now, right?
So some of it's changing. We're starting, and it's happening through, we're Americans, we don't do regulation, we do litigation, so it's happening through lawsuits. But the other thing is we need to establish standards. So I'm looking at this, we have over the door right there an EXIT in bright colors. Did that happen because this building, the people who built it were just really, really nice? Or was there something put in place that required every every business to implement this? And then it was allowed them to interpret in certain ways. So you've got to change the incentive structures. The other thing is I'm very positive on the cyber insurance market as another way to incentivize better behavior. We see that in areas like fire and car insurance. Why not here?
Right here, yes.
Good morning.
One of our former colleagues.
Right. Good morning, Steve Vito with Sage Communications. Snowden's been a big part of the conversation this morning, and it was just reported on CNN, Fox, others, that he's open to returning to the United States, even if it includes some jail time. First part of the question is, how likely do you think that's going to happen anytime soon? And two, what would a deal even look like?
Shane?
I think that the window of opportunity for him to negotiate a plea is probably closing, if not closed. I mean, and the reason for that is I think intelligence officials have a pretty good handle on how he did what he did, what was compromised, what was taken. Earlier on, you were hearing signals from people in the community saying we would really like to talk more with him about what he did, and maybe we cut a deal if he was willing to sort of lay it on the table. Here's where I went. Here are the things that I exposed. I had not seen that report, but I would imagine that if he is now holding out the possibility of coming back and perhaps even serving jail time, I would imagine part of what's motivating him is the desire to no longer stay in Russia. I mean, I want to look at those comments, but I mean, maybe his term as a guest is coming. Is
the summer's
expiring.
over and winter's coming again. So.
Right, but I mean, if you talk to people in the community about the damage that he did operationally, they will say yes, there was operational damage. We are recovering from that. We are sort of rebuilding. But the political consequences of what he did, it goes back to the question of eroding trust,
right,
of what it did to relationships with Silicon Valley companies. That's, I think, much more long-term and fundamental. I have always imagined that his story will eventually end with him coming back to the U.S. It's just always...
Congressman Ratcliffe is here, but I feel like we should take a real quick question. Right here. Uno mas, por favor. There we go. Really fast question, really fast answer.
The answer is no.
Thank you. Tim Bennett, the Transatlantic Business Council. I want to go, Shane, you and Peter, perhaps. We are dealing with commercial warfare.
This got to be short.
Right? And the old problem of plausible deniability. If the government, NSA, say specifically, won't share information they have on the theft of intellectual property, commercial data, how good is the forensic capability in the private sector today?
Good and getting a lot better. And that's where companies are turning for their intelligence, not to the government.
The challenge is becoming less so attribution, which has been the big point of discussion in the last several years, to more accountability. What do I do? So I know, be it this Chinese government unit or North Korea or whatever did it, what can I do back? And that's the thorny question for an administration, but also for private business.
Also, what can I reveal to prove that I know what I know? That's the problem for the NSA.
Ladies and gentlemen, Shane Harris of Daily Beast, Peter Singer of New America, and his new book, Ghost Fleet, and Claude Barfield of the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you very, very much for joining.